All right, so that's our next conversation this morning. The electoral system, and of course, against the backdrop of that report that INEC has budgeted 305 billion naira to prosecute the 2023 general elections and so many others. Well, this morning we have Cynthia Mbamalu, who is co-founder Yaga Africa. She's a legal practitioner as well as a human rights and gender rights activist. Joins us along with Ezenwa Nwagu. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Let me begin with you, madam. Receiving that news from INEC, what's your impression? Too much or too little?
Well, good morning. And I think first, it sounded, the amount was a bit huge. But by the time you sit and look through what actually goes into elections administration and the several factors to consider, you'd actually reconsider that position. And I think for me, what is important is not necessarily about the amount, but the value for money. Because it's one thing to budget an amount for elections, it's another to actually achieve value. So for instance, if you look at the trend of cost of elections in Nigeria and juxtapose that with the turnout of voters and participation in itself, we begin to question if the spending this much in conducting elections is actually giving us the value that we need to build the democracy that we're hoping to achieve. And I think for me, that is what is important. But if you look around elections administration, there are several things to consider. What constitutes administration of elections? There is the cost if you think about it, the cost, what you consider population of voters. As at 2019, we're about 84 million voters. And with the ongoing CVR, there's a likelihood for that number to increase a lot more by the next general elections. The other thing to look at is number of polling units that we have. INEC created new polling units, if you remember this year. So we have an increase in number of polling, meaning you'd be looking at higher cost of personnel to be deployed to manage elections. You look at things like number of political parties contesting and how that affects ballot paper production. And so you'd also consider that, then look at frequency of elections. We're in a country where we have off-cycle elections and by-elections every year. So that also is also part of this cost. So if you think about it, if you look at the broader scale of events, the administration itself has a huge implication for a country with a large population of voters, for a country with a large number of parties contesting, for a country with elections happening every year, and also for a country that is also testing out technology and different innovation in the electoral process. So if you think about that and then you break down the figures, because you also think about the administration cost for INEC itself as an institution. So if you break that down and compare that to what is feasible per voter, you could say that amount may actually just be the right amount to consider. And if you think about the fact that with COVID-19, there's actually an increase in the budget because now things about production of PPEs, things about provision of sanitary materials at the polling units. All of this also come with additional costs for the elections. So yes, the amount is huge, but it's actually suits what we hope to achieve. We're yet to do a major breakdown of that, to see the breakdown of the budget. However, beyond that is actually the value for money, because at the end of it all, if we have less than 40% of voters turning out to vote. Anambra had 10.27% for the amount spent in Anambra governorship elections. Only about 10% turned out to vote. In the 2019 general elections, we had barely 35% voters turning out to vote. So at the end, we spend a lot, but the voters, Nigerians do not come out in numbers to vote, and the political parties are not helping the situation because their role also in the electoral process actually undermines the process, but also creates a lot of disincentives for citizens to actually participate. So there's a lot more beyond just the figure. I think at the end is to talk about what is the cost of election vis-a-vis the value for money, the quality of participation, and the impact of the electoral process in building Nigeria's democracy to the point where we are hoping we would get to.
Well, Mr. Ezenwa, let me take your own opening comments on that as well. There's still so much to talk about. 260 line items, 305 billion naira bill for you to pay. Too much or too little?
Well, I think Cynthia has covered the field a bit in terms of what that money will be meant for and whether we can get value for that humongous amount of money that we invest in elections. But at the end of the day, you plan for every prospective voter. Because it's a democracy, even if it is one person at the end of the day that comes out to vote, you are not going to be planning for one person. You are going to be planning for the number of people who have participated through the electoral process. And that process does not just start with election, it starts with registration. There are many other reasons why people register, but whether those reasons have something to do with E-Day itself, the election day itself or not, the Electoral Management Body has a responsibility and duty to invest resources and time to make sure that everybody who has registered that decides to come out to vote is adequately taken care of. That means that if you have 100 million prospective voters, you are going to prepare 100 million ballot papers. You are going to prepare result sheets. You are going to mobilize vendors. You are going to pay officials. You are going to also have contingency arrangements in case the process does not go off in one beat. If you're going to have a runoff or you're going to have a by-election and all the rest of them. So administratively speaking, there is a huge cost for democracy. And that is part of what we will continue to work around to first and foremost remove unnecessary expenditures. For instance, you pay people, vendors to mobilize vehicles to take materials from one point to the other. We must at some point be thinking how to reduce costs and also get punctuality index for opening of the polls to be high. So whichever way we go, we can't escape investing the kind of resources that we put into sustaining elections, electoral process, and democracy.
Okay.
The other cost is higher, really.
Apologies for butting in. You both have talked about justifying the budget by getting value for money, irrespective of what the bill is. But then the crucial element of voter education, which has been responsible for or not for the dwindling number of voters per time, is also something very troubling. So in terms of justifying resources for voter education, how well would you say we're doing in that regard, given that on the one hand, in the last election in Anambra, for instance, INEC weeded out something in the region of about 10,000 people from the voter register, reducing the number that was there hitherto. And the fact that people are still asking questions about the voter register itself. So there are questions around the voter register on the one hand and voter participation at the elections, which has continued to dwindle over the years. So in terms of justifying voter education budgeting, for instance, how well would you think we're doing that and in that regard, and what should we be doing to justify that bill?
Well, I think that my quick sense would be to say that we have generally an attitude that is very ritualistic when it comes to voter education. And what I mean by that is that our idea of voter education majorly stops at taking out adverts, taking out time slots in televisions, and mobilizing some kind of movement around communities that talks about why people should. But I think it has to be much, much deeper than that. In some places, you have people they call civic educators. These civic educators are not just they are not just ad hoc. They are people who, whether there is election or there is no election, they have responsibility to continue to broaden conversations around participation in elections. And like I keep saying, participation in the electoral process transcends the election day. When you have 84 million people go to register, they have participated. Now, getting them to go and vote is a function of a lot of other things. It could be there are people who will say, oh, we don't get value for our investment in democracy. We are not getting dividends of democracy. And then some of the other issues, for instance, management of expectations, like the one that we just, the shock of the president withholding assent, for instance. A lot of Nigerians, whether they understand the issues or not, think that he should have assented. And if he didn't assent, that it has probably affected the credibility or the acceptability of future elections. But the reality is that there needs to be a conversation that is broader, that is deeper, that is inclusive, that is touring on the issues, and to also explain the values of democracy, which has much more to do not just with dividends of democracy, but also the values of freedom, intrinsic values of freedom to choose that person that will lead or govern. And that value is so intrinsic that if you now compare to when you are ruled by people who you have not even any iota of contribution in how they emerge, and they decide for you through, we still talk about representation, budgets, and all of those issues. The absence and lack of interest in those areas is also part of the contributory factor to why we are not seeing E-Day activities the way we should have them. So civic educators come in very handy. We need to also expand budget for not just INEC, but for National Orientation Agency. A lot of people think that NOA should come out, frontally in civic education, in voter education, and the rest of them. But the budget line for an agency of that importance is something that people can put in their back pockets at the end of the year. So we are not investing in voter education. And even when INEC itself tells you that it's investing in voter education, if you listen, and it's not just INEC alone, if you listen to what they call voter education programs on television, on radio, they are more of about activities of the chief executives and what INEC is doing, rather than educating the people about what they need to know to advance democracy and elections.
Okay, let me send this question to Cynthia, and I'm wondering, I know that there are those who will argue that if we think that democracy is expensive, perhaps we should try the lack of it, and we know that that is certainly not an option. However, when we look at 305 billion, we know that it would seem that increasingly over the years, every time we have talked about how much it's going to cost to run the next cycle of elections, the price tag has only gone up. And there'll be questions as to what we're going to do to bring it down. When you look at all our other competing needs, the fact that, we have to talk about education, health, security, and all of these other needs that we have as a people. And when you also look at how much we're dedicating to citizen, even in our budgets, there are those who say if you were to look at the cost of these elections per voter, it looks like we've dedicated much more to providing for our voters to vote than for the entire and total welfare of Nigerian citizens. What will be your argument on that?
Okay, so I'll look at it from two folds. First, the fact that elections, democracy is expensive, and presidential elections themselves, in their nature, our presidential systems are quite expensive to run. That is one angle. The cost of running a system of government, the presidential system of government, and also that democracy. The other point, the other part for me is also about the value of democracy itself, and why do I think those are very important factors? The first, if you look at the value of democracy, what does it bring? And I think, as Ezenwa mentioned it earlier, it's beyond just dividends of democracy, it's about freedom. And whether we want to appreciate it or not, we're in a system where we have reasonable or relative freedom to make decisions, to hold leaders to account, to express our views and our opinions, which is what you wouldn't see in other forms of government. For a country with a history of military dictatorship, where we know that the fight for democracy in itself was one very brutal journey. We had citizens who lost their lives just in the demand for democracy. We had people who lost their freedom just in demand for democracy. And we finally got to where we are. While it's not a perfect system, but all we can do is to push for more freedom through democracy than to push for less freedom and undermine or water down the whole idea of democracy itself. So that's one hand. And tied within that is the whole conversation around the quality of leadership. Because trust me, if we have good leadership and if we have quality leadership, the conversation will not necessarily be the cost. The conversation will be how can we make the system more effective. But at the moment, the reason why a lot of citizens will say, why are we spending this much on elections? Because for a lot of citizens, the question is beyond just we're spending so much. It's the fact that we spend so much and then those who emerge from the system are not even representing our interests. As simple as withholding assent on election amendment bill, as simple as stalling on important legislative actions in National Assembly that can better the lives of citizens. All of this creates a lot of questions for the people, because for them is we spend so much, we vote, but we can't see the quality of leadership. So that also is tied to the whole idea of the value of democracy in itself. And if we have quality leadership, we will not necessarily be focusing on the cost. Then the other part I talked about was the fact that presidential systems of government are expensive and our form of elections, our electoral systems are quite expensive. However, are there opportunities within that space to manage costs in the sense that we look at how do we ensure that while we know it's an expensive system, that there are important areas where savings can be made. And I was reading about Ghana in the Ghanaian elections. Now, for instance, Ghana in 2016 actually spent a lot more in their elections than Nigeria. And Nigeria actually has more voter population than in Ghana. So in 2016, it cost the Ghanaian IEC, Independent Electoral Commission, about $13 per voter for their elections. While for the 2015 general elections in Nigeria, it was about $8.5 per voter in Nigeria. However, by 2020, when the Ghanaian IEC was interacting with people, said they were reviewing their costs and they were able to reduce the cost per voter to $7 from $13. And just reading through to see what did the IEC do in Ghana, and things as simple as reviewing their procurement system, reviewing where production is done, and because if you produce a lot more, if you focus on producing a lot more of your materials outside, you may spend a lot more. So they were basically looking at opportunities within the budget to save costs. So while they had an increase with respect to COVID, planning for COVID, with the respect of COVID-19 realities, they still were able to reduce from $13 per voter to $7 per voter, regardless of the increase in number of voters. And I think that there's a learning opportunity for INEC within that space. So while we know it costs us to conduct elections, but we also believe that if we look within our budgets, there are things that we can actually begin to review. And I think Ezenwa started the conversation around things around vendor selections and even how much we spend. If you think about the Anambra elections, where monies were invested in vendors for election material transportation, and on elections day, a lot of these vendors was the road transport workers pulled out from the contract while monies were spent already? What is the cost for that breach of contract? Because if payments have been made and monies have been expended, we want to see value, we want to see delivery on that mandate. So even within the budget in itself, we still believe that INEC can look within it and identify opportunities for saving costs, especially looking at procurement in itself, looking at logistics management and planning, operations. Those are opportunities, those are areas where fundings or where specific budget line items can actually be reviewed and certain costs can be done. If a country like Ghana can actually look within that and cut its cost from 2016 to 2020 from $13 to $7 per head, I think Nigeria can actually look within that. However, we cannot run away from the costs of elections. But in the broader scale of events, the reason why a lot of Nigerians, if you think about why Nigerians scream and are angry and agitated with how much it costs to run the government, is basically tied to the whole concept of the quality of leadership, because consistently we're seeing the failure of leadership at all levels, from the national to the state level to the local level. So yes, monies are expended, but for those who emerge, they are yet to represent the wills and the wishes of the people. So at the end of it all, it's almost as if we spend so much to elect people who do not understand that they represent Nigerians whose public funds were invested in getting them into office. And that is the bigger question, that while we talk about cost, we're also looking at the quality of governance and how much we lose by poor governance in Nigeria. But at the end of it, if we do not get leadership right, we cannot solve a lot of problems. We cannot answer these questions, and we cannot justify the amount we spend on elections if leaders cannot even represent the interests of the people, and if we cannot see development the way we want to see and feel it as citizens in Nigeria.
Well, Madam, it's interesting that we put these issues the way it is now. But the question then would be, even in the quality of staffing of INEC officials, whether they are the staff or the ad hoc staff and all of those things, there are all kinds of questions here and there. You have talked about the fact that we need to tinker with our processes to ensure that we can cut costs. I did a little math, and I realized that if all 200 million Nigerians are to contribute to raise 305 billion naira, then each one of us will be spending 1,525 naira. But then talking about how much the INEC will spend on the 84 million plus voters is something in the region of 3,600 naira. But in terms of the processes and all of those things that you have talked about, how significantly do you think technology infusion will help reduce this bill in the long run?
Thank you. That's a very important question, because at the end of it all, what do we spend a lot of monies doing? When you think about technology, if you procure technology is supposed to serve you for a period of time. All you need to do is to upgrade and update. And if you procure the right technology, because there's also the likelihood for sabotage, where individuals within the system do not want things to work. We could invest a lot of money, procure technology that wouldn't function or last beyond an electoral cycle. So, but once there is a lot of work that has gone into the process of procurement to ensure that the right technology has been procured to suit the needs or to meet the needs that is required to actually serve, then I think we actually begin to say, because what you do is you procure once and it serves an electoral cycle. All you need to do is update and upgrade. And then it takes away some of the other expenses that would go into things like paper production, for instance. So if we want to think about the future of elections in Nigeria, and the fact that when it comes to elections management, that there are several factors that need to be in place to guarantee trust in the process. And so let's talk about the conversation around electronic transmission of results. Why was this a pertinent conversation? The idea was a lot of citizens did not trust the collation process, and because the results collation process remained the weakest link in our electoral process. And the idea of electronic transmission of results was to help bridge that gap, to complement the manual process in a way that guarantees better transparency transparency of the results management process, and also inspires trust and confidence in the process for both voters and even stakeholders engaging the electoral process. So that is one arm. And and one of the things I actually found interesting was the idea of a BVAS, for instance, introduced by INEC. It was to serve multiple purposes. So the BVAS is what is it serves the IVED, that is voter enrollment as a voter enrollment device at the registration period, and for on elections day, it is used to both accredit voters and to transmit results. So it serves multiple functions. So we did not need to procure several other technologies to serve different purposes, but one that will provide multiple.
My apologies.
Yeah.
In the long run, your position now is, inclusion of technology will help
technology helps save costs in elections.
Okay. Well, very quick one from Mr. Ezenwa-Nwagwu just before we close. This budget, I don't know how significantly do you think it will help to also secure the electoral process a little more?
Well, I think that we must also admit that we've made significant and incremental progress in our electoral journey. We are not where we are. We're working to improve that process. So some of the investments that you see are actually to guarantee electoral integrity. Why do you need BVAS? Why do you need smart card readers? Why do you want to do all of that? It's because the trust level and the attitude of the political actors itself is not one that guarantees trust. So we are putting a lot of money to secure the electoral process, to make it more trusting for citizens, and we are seeing much of that. There is we were coming from a place where you are voting. Sometimes the results of where you are voting will be announced. We are shifting away from ballot box snatching, pouring ink into the voters, the what do you call it, the voting box, and all of those kind of things. So this shift has its own costs, and as we shift, we pay more, and we will continue to pay more. But I just want to underscore the fact that democracy does not guarantee you good leadership. What it guarantees you is freedom to choose. So if you find out, if the process is such that is embedded with integrity and trust, if the person you eventually elect does not serve that purpose, the joy, the beauty of democracy is that ability to take that person away and elect another person. And it is not a walk in the park. We are coming from an immediate effect mentality. We are coming from a place of, it must happen. This journey is a journey that needs investment of time, resources, money, knowledge, education. And as we continue
to work on that. Yes, we'll continue to continue on that journey, just as you have said, because most certainly I don't think anyone wants to see the end of the Fourth Republic just yet. We have to thank you very much for your contribution this morning. Ezenwa-Nwagwu is Chairman Partners for Electoral Reform, along with Cynthia Mbamalu, who is co-founder IAGA Africa. She's a human and gender rights activist. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us this morning.
Thank you.